Welcome back, everyone, to round 7 of Titled Tuesday. Today, we're looking at a game from the absolute beast, Arjun Erigaisi, playing with the white pieces against Cem Kaan Gokerkan. Arjun kicks things off with knight f3, d5. c4, we are in the reti opening. Black has many options here. Very common is pawn to e6 to support the center, or pawn to c6 heading into a Slav-type setup. Gokerkan says, no thanks to the solid setups, and plays pawn to d4, grabbing space in the reti advance variation. White has a few interesting replies here. A fun option is the immediate gambit, pawn to b4, or simply fianchettoing the bishop with pawn to g3, e3. Black has a few options to respond to this pressure. You could defend the advanced pawn with pawn to c5, or capture on e3 to mess up white's pawn structure a little bit. Knight c6. Cem Kaan takes a few seconds off the clock here to develop a piece and defend the center. A very natural option for white here is to just take the pawn on d4, asking black to prove their compensation. But instead, Arjun throws the b pawn up the board to b4. The idea is to push to b5, kicking the knight away and leaving the d4 pawn completely undefended. Black ignores the tension and just takes the pawn on e3, creating a dangerous threat of their own to capture on f2 with check. White recaptures with the f pawn, sidestepping the check on f2 while preparing to seize the center with pawn to d4. Black snatches the pawn on b4 with the knight, stopping white from immediately seizing the center with pawn to d4. White naturally develops the knight to c3. Black responds by bringing the knight to f6. White pushes the pawn to d4, grabbing center space. The point of this move is a vicious trap. White threatens a queen check on a4 to win the loose knight. Black plays pawn to g6. And that is a massive blunder. Playing this in just 2 seconds completely misses white's threat to jump in with the queen check. Let's look at a better variation. Better would have been pushing the black pawn to e5, then white knight would capture on e5, and our bishop could swing to f5. This would look much better. Okay, now let's get back to the game. But wait, white plays the rook to b1! That is also a huge blunder. Erigaisi completely misses the free piece. It was vital to play the queen to a4, picking up the loose knight. Instead, the rook move merely threatens to chop off the knight on b4. Black retreats the knight to c6, saving it from the rook. However, this is a mistake. It was better to strike at the center with pawn to c5. White pushes the pawn to d5, kicking the knight and threatening to capture it. Black has to retreat the knight to b8 to avoid losing it. Now pawn to e4. White continues to grab space, threatening to march the pawn forward again to e5 to attack the f6 knight. Black fianchettos the bishop to g7, preparing to meet the e5 pawn push. White keeps marching with pawn to e5, threatening to capture the knight on f6 and gain even more territory. The knight safely escapes to g4. White brings the bishop to f4, reinforcing the center and preparing to kick the knight with pawn to h3. Black castles, but this is actually a blunder. It was vital to play the knight to d7 to start unraveling the position. White kicks the knight with pawn to h3, shutting down black's idea of playing the knight to d7. Black retreats the knight to h6, looking to challenge white's center with pawn to e6. White brings the queen to d2, halting black's e6 break. The idea is to set up a nasty trap. White wants to chop off the knight on h6 with the bishop, ruining black's kingside. Black wisely repositions the knight to f5, escaping the bishop's crosshairs and once again preparing the e6 push. White is relentless. Pawn to g4 directly attacks the knight, stopping the e6 break in its tracks. Black spent almost half a minute here and strikes back with pawn to f6. They are trying to blow open the center, threatening to take the pawn on e5 and collapse white's structure. White ignores the tension and just takes the knight on f5, setting up a brutal new threat to push pawn to e6. Black recaptures with the bishop, eliminating the e6 threat, while renewing the attack on the e5 pawn. White slides the rook out of the line of fire to b3. The point of this move is to finally push that pawn to e6, cutting off black's coordination. Black captures the pawn on e5, stopping the push and immediately threatening the bishop on f4. White recaptures with the bishop, avoiding the pawn capture and looking to trade off black's vital dark squared defender on g7. Black trades the bishops. White takes back with the knight, cementing a strong outpost in the center. Black brings the queen out to d6, threatening to immediately capture the centralized knight. The queen slides over to e3, safely defending the knight. Black plays the knight to d7, piling on the pressure and threatening to win the e5 knight. White decides to simplify and trades the knights, temporarily creating a threat to take the rook on f8. Black recaptures with the bishop, saving the rook from the knight's attack. White plays king to d2. This looks absolutely unhinged, but with the center locked up, the king steps up to safely defend the weak squares. Black lifts the rook to f4, preparing to clamp down on the queen side with pawn to b6. White pushes pawn to c5, immediately attacking the queen and threatening to capture it. However, this is a mistake. It was better to grab the loose pawn with the rook to b7. Black slides the queen over to f6, getting out of danger and suddenly threatening to sacrifice the rook for the bishop on f1. White develops the bishop to e2, safely moving it away from the rook's crosshairs. Black doubles up the rooks on the f-file. However, this is a mistake. Black needed to shore up the queenside with pawn to b6. Now, white has an opening. White casually grabs a pawn on b7, getting the rook to safety and ignoring the terrifying dark clouds gathering around their king. Black plays queen to g5. The idea is to unleash a devastating discovered attack, starting with rook to d4 check. White plays rook to b4, directly challenging the black rook and neutralizing the d4 discovered check. Black pushes pawn to e5, looking to kick the rook with a5. However, this is a costly mistake. It was vital to keep the pressure up with queen to h4. White captures en passant on e6, simultaneously opening lines and threatening to trade rooks on f4. Black plays the bishop to c6, attacking the rook on h1, and setting up a sneaky threat to swing the rook to d8 with check. White pushes the pawn to e7! What a crushing blow to end the game! By attacking the rook on f8, white stops the d8 check and threatens to promote to a new queen. Black resigned here. What an absolute roller coaster of a game from Arjun Erigaisi. It really shows how you can use space and aggressive pawn pushes to completely suffocate your opponent, even if your king is sitting in the middle of the board. Arjun eventually went on to finish 4th in this titled Tuesday with a massive 9 out of 11 points. If you enjoyed this crazy clash, make sure to leave a comment down below and subscribe for more amazing chess content.